In 1960, one of the most tragic disasters in the history of space exploration occurred. An explosion at the Baikonur Cosmodrome claimed the lives of about 100 people. The Soviet authorities classified everything related to this incident. In this video, I want to talk about this disaster, as well as other terrible incidents connected to the conquest of space. The first two disasters of the USA and USSR, the X-15 and Soyuz 1, were two important missions in the history of the space age that unfortunately ended in disaster. Of course, one could argue whether the X-15 project should be considered part of the space program, since it was a hypersonic aircraft and not a rocket. But I'll let you decide for yourselves. Gagarin's spaceflight took place at an altitude of 160 kilometers. To be precise, its parameters varied, but that's another story. Officially, a country's airspace ends at the Kármán line, which is at 100 kilometers, since that's where space begins. According to US standards, space is considered to begin at an altitude of 80 kilometers. The Earth's atmosphere ends at an altitude of 3,000 kilometers. So, what should we consider as space? The X-15 project was an experimental hypersonic aircraft developed in the United States back in the 1950s by North America. The first flights began in 1959. These aircraft completed 199 flights at speeds exceeding 7 Mach. It flew at altitudes above 100 kilometers. By the way, an interesting fact. From 1960 to 1962, the very same Neil Armstrong, who later landed on the moon, flew this aircraft. During all these flights, there was only one fatal accident. It was the 191st flight on the 15th of November 1967. For pilot Michael James Adams, this was already his 7th flight on the X-15, so he already had experience operating this craft. But during the climb, the aircraft entered a hypersonic spin. Adams did not know how to regain control of the craft at such speed, as there were no instructions for this situation. He fought desperately with the machine, and after some time he managed to regain control of the aircraft. However, for unknown reasons, the aircraft broke apart right in midair, and Soyuz 1 was no longer an airplane, but the first manned spacecraft. Please don't confuse this with the first human spaceflight, because Gagarin was launched like a dummy. In other words, a dog or a monkey could have been in his place, nothing would have changed. So, Vladimir Mikhailovich Komarov was the first Soviet cosmonaut to pilot a manned craft. According to the plan, this spacecraft was supposed to enter orbit, and then a second spacecraft, Soyuz 2, was to be launched after it. They were supposed to perform the world's first docking there. But due to problems at launch with Soyuz 1, this plan was cancelled. As soon as Soyuz 1 entered orbit, it immediately started having problems. One of the solar panel arrays failed to deploy, causing the spacecraft to experience a shortage of electrical power. As a result, it was decided to end the mission early. On the 19th orbit around the Earth, the spacecraft left orbit. Komarov, while piloting the spacecraft, did everything correctly, strictly according to the instructions. But after entering the dense layers of the atmosphere, at an altitude of 7 kilometers, the drogue parachute failed to pull the main parachute out of its container, and at an altitude of 1.5 kilometers, the main parachute did not deploy. Its lines became entangled around the undeployed drogue parachute from the main system. As a result, the capsule hit the ground at a speed of 180 kilometers per hour and caught fire. But the cosmonaut died instantly from the impact itself, even before the fire. Just imagine his state of mind a second before death. His parachute system failed him twice. VSS Enterprise 2014. We live in an amazing time. If in the past only entire nations could afford to conquer space, today private companies are doing it. Virgin Galactic, a company founded by billionaire Richard Branson, plans to conduct commercial flights into space. On the 11th of July 2021, the VSS Unity spaceplane already made its first commercial flight, with the owner of the company, Branson himself, among the 6 passengers on board. Already today, about 600 people have paid for their tickets and are waiting in line for flights. But first, everything needs to be checked. That's why they conduct test after test. And one of these tests ended badly. On the 31st of October 2014, the VSS Enterprise spaceplane crashed during a flight. The cause of the tragedy was a mistake made by the co-pilot. Due to the high G-forces, he became nervous and unlocked the tail assembly, putting it into braking position prematurely. It is strictly forbidden to do this during acceleration. But the company relied entirely on the professionalism of the pilots, without taking the psychological factor into account. As a result, the spaceplane broke apart in flight due to the G-forces. The commander ejected, but his co-pilot was killed. The surviving pilot recounted that he lost consciousness twice. The first time due to the G-forces, and the second time because of a lack of oxygen. He didn't have time to activate the emergency oxygen supply system. He regained consciousness when the parachute jerked him and was able to land safely. The fuel tank fire at Baikonur in 1960. At the Baikonur Cosmodrome in 1960, 30 minutes before the scheduled launch of the R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile, an unauthorized ignition of the second stage engine occurred. Because of this, the first stage tanks were destroyed and the rocket fuel components exploded. As was typical in the USSR, no one knew about this disaster. After all, everything was classified. Information about this only became available in 1989. As a result of the disaster, between 92 and 126 people died, but the exact numbers are still unknown. Such casualties occurred due to violations of technical safety regulations. Many high-ranking engineers and military officers died, including the chief designer of the missile, Mitrovan Nedelin. This incident became known as the Nedelin disaster or the Baikonur tragedy. Explosion of fuel tanks at Plesetsk in 1980. And once again, we touch on the military topic. This time, on the 18th of March, 1980, a military satellite launch was planned at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. But in the Vostok 2M launch vehicle, which was supposed to put this satellite into orbit, there was a fuel leak. As a result, a powerful explosion occurred. It was followed by 4 more explosions. And once again, there were human casualties. Why do people keep dying during rocket launches? This time, 48 people were killed. Among them were many conscript soldiers who were standing around the perimeter guarding the launch site. They were burned alive. The investigation revealed that the cause was the use of catalytically active materials in the manufacture of hydrogen peroxide filters. But this was only determined in 1996 by a second commission, which cleared the Cosmodrome's launch crew of blame. After all, at first, everything was blamed on them. The disaster at the Xichang Cosmodrome in 1996. The Chinese Xichang Cosmodrome has been operational since 1984. Construction began back in 1967, but in 1972, funding for the project was cut due to a political purge of scientists. Construction resumed only 10 years later and was completed in 1984. That same year, the first rocket launch took place. Of course, China has not been without its own tragedies. On the 14th of February, 1996, along the 3rd of March B rocket was launched with a satellite on board. And after 22 seconds of flight, it crashed into a village. To this day, the number of people who died in the village remains unknown. Chinese authorities reported 6 dead and 57 injured. Various Western sources disagree with this and believe that the number of victims was higher. The cause of the tragedy was a failure in the flight control system's electronics. The death of Mike Hughes. 2,263 years ago, for the first time, the Greek scholar Eratosthenes of Cyrene calculated the radius of the Earth. According to his calculations, he came out to 6,287 kilometers, which is not much different from the modern value of 6,371 kilometers. So, even without rockets and satellites, people had no doubt that the Earth was round. So what happened to our contemporaries? 64-year-old Mike Hughes was one of the flat earthers. And instead of climbing a mountain or flying in an airplane, he wanted to build his own rocket, fly it, and prove to everyone that the Earth is flat. Note that his rocket was supposed to reach an altitude of 1,525 meters. There are many mountains that are higher. He spent $18,000 on this project. What could possibly go wrong with that kind of budget? In this video, we see his steam-powered rocket take off and lose its parachute right at the start. But what stopped him from wearing a parachute himself? He could have asked any glider pilot about safety systems, and they would have told him that they always wear special compact parachutes. Even more than that, they could have taken him up to an altitude of over 4,000 meters, where he could have admired the beauty of the Earth without risking his life. This is what happens when you don't do well in school. Apollo 1. This tragedy occurred on the 27th of January, 1967. Still during the testing phase. The most terrible thing is that it all happened on Earth, and in theory, there were people who could help in case something went wrong. A simulation of the spacecraft launch was being conducted, and oxygen with a high concentration was pumped inside. But the problem was that a fire suddenly broke out, and the oxygen intensified the effect many times over. Everything happened very quickly. As a result, all 3 crew members, Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, were burned alive. A terrible death. You wouldn't wish that even on your worst enemy. But what were the causes of the tragedy? The Apollo series spacecraft used pure oxygen at low pressure instead of regular air, because it was lighter and more convenient for spacewalks. But on Earth and during training, the oxygen pressure was increased, which made some materials extremely flammable. NASA did not want to switch this gas to a nitrogen-oxygen mix, because they considered it safe and simple. Most likely, the fire started because of a spark or a short circuit in the wiring. The commission that investigated the accident found several places in the spacecraft where this could have happened. As soon as the fire started, the flames spread rapidly and damaged the astronauts' spacesuits. The complex hatch and its locks prevented the crew from quickly opening the hatch from inside. The commission stated that the astronauts died from inhaling smoke 14 seconds after the fire began. Soyuz 11. Soyuz 11 was the last spacecraft in the Soyuz mission. On the 6th of June 1971, the launch proceeded as planned. The crew of 3, after spending 23 days aboard the station, set a world record for the longest human stay in space. On the 30th of June, 1971, during their return to Earth, an air leak occurred. The cosmonauts simply suffocated. It's terrifying to imagine your consciousness gradually fading away due to lack of oxygen. This was the first death of humans in outer space in history. After this incident, a mandatory rule was introduced requiring the use of spacesuits during launch and landing. So does that mean they would have definitely survived if this rule had been implemented earlier? So many people worked on the project, and yet no one thought of such a simple solution. The tragedy occurred due to a technical malfunction in the descent module separation system. The Challenger disaster. In this disaster, all 7 crew members remained alive until the very end. On the 28th of January 1986, at an altitude of 14 kilometers, at the 73rd second of the Challenger shuttle's flight, the left booster separated from one of its 2 mounts. It punctured the main fuel tank, causing an explosion. The cockpit with the pilots was torn off as a result of the explosion. The crew members were conscious and even managed to activate their personal air supply devices. They died upon impact with the water after falling from a height of 20 kilometers. Among the crew was an ordinary teacher, Krista McAuliffe, who had won a nationwide competition for the right to fly into space. This is how chance can sometimes influence a person's fate. This disaster was captured on video, and a huge number of viewers witnessed the incident. Even the commentator did not immediately realize that a tragedy had occurred. All the observers hoped that the situation could be corrected. The Columbia disaster, and again a catastrophe occurred, this time during the return to Earth. But the tragedy had already been predetermined at the launch stage. Only no one knew about it. Or rather, that's not quite true. The engineers suspected that the insulation might have been damaged and insisted that the astronauts visually inspect the damaged area. NASA management denied their request. They were also refused access to data from the military. Personally, I don't understand why the management was so indifferent. The thing is, during liftoff, a piece of solid insulation material broke off from the fuel tank and damaged the ceramic thermal protection coating on the shuttle's wing. As a result, on the 1st of February 2003, during re-entry to Earth, part of the shuttle's wing could not withstand the high temperatures, and the spacecraft completely disintegrated in the air at an altitude of 63 kilometers. 7 astronauts lost their lives. This event led to the suspension of shuttle flights for a full 2 years. Space exploration has always been accompanied by danger, but as technology advances, these flights are becoming more and more reliable. The future is not far off and ordinary people will be able to travel to space just as they fly on airplanes today. That's all from us. Goodbye, everyone.